And as usual, I'm going to give it some time to breathe here and work with my settings. For some reason, when I start this on my own Facebook channel, it used to be able to stream into the New Day Global Facebook group without me having to do anything. And for some reason, every time I start it, it goes to private. So I need to change it to public and then share it. Oh, I didn't put a description in. I was running a little bit late. So just making sure I got it up everywhere I want to have it. I didn't put a description in. So today I want to talk about the self and the right-hand path or left-hand path. Basically, kind of sum up or summarize what I've been talking about the last few weeks. I've thrown a lot of stuff out there. A lot of stuff. Talked about right-hand path, left-hand path. Good morning, Claire. Good morning, Marietta. Thank you for joining me, both of you. So I've been throwing a lot of stuff out there, introduced to some of you the terms right-hand path, left-hand path, and then talked about various different things about the self, the shadow self, the right hemisphere and left hemisphere of the brain. We talked about Lucifer. We talked about Lilith. We talked about shadow work. We talked about the sacred feminine, for sure. All this kind of stuff. So I'm going to try to bring it all together today around essentially this issue of self. I want to just check one more thing here. Yep. Okay. Just want to make sure it was also showing in the group. Hey, Shannon, I can see comments today. So we'll see how that goes. Sometimes I get distracted and lose my train of thought. It's part of my ADHD, I guess. Oh, yeah, I wanted to announce, so got a couple of special things coming up for those of you. First of all, in the New Day Global group, Michelle Cohen has agreed to host a Zoom call on the left-hand path. We're going to do that next Sunday after I finish this up. Usually finish up about 11 o'clock my time, 1 o'clock Eastern time. I'm in the Mountain Time Zone. And then at 12 o'clock my time or 2 o'clock Eastern time, we're going to do a Zoom call. She'll be posting that. It's strictly for those of you that have joined the New Day Global Facebook group. So if you want to get in on that, you've got to be a member of the New Day Global Facebook group. It's free of charge. It's just a way to connect and build community. A lot of you post way more than I do, but I try to go in and at least read everything, look at everything. And I just I love the content, love the community, love the support that I see that everyone's getting. So we're going to do that Zoom call. If you're interested in that, it's going to be a time to just not just question and answer. There'll be some question and answer, but also a time for people to reflect on some of the stuff that we've been talking about, particularly regarding these spiritual paths, right-hand path, left-hand path. So opportunity for people, if they want to ask questions, you can ask them in the chat. If you're too shy on the Zoom call, participate in the chat, all of that good stuff. And then hopefully get your thoughts as well. I think I said in one of these episodes, when I started this left-hand path stuff, I was surprised at the momentum that it gained. But I really appreciated how deeply people were engaging with the material and thinking about that stuff. And so we just, we're better together than we are apart. And so this will be kind of the next step. Maybe if it goes well, we'll do more of these kinds of things. So that's going to be next Sunday at 2 o'clock Eastern time. You can adjust for your time zone. And again, that's only to the New Day Global group. And then the following Sunday for Sunday Morning Live, I'm really excited about this. I'm going to have Lisa Brown as my guest in 2 weeks, and we're going to be talking about astrology. Lisa is one of the few people I know who I would consider an expert in that field. And that will be fun, and that will be eye-opening for people as well. So looking forward to that one. She did an astrological reading for me around my birthday, and I was mind blown. If I wasn't a believer before in astrology, I definitely would have come away from that session with Lisa as a believer. So Lisa's part of the New Day Global live group. And anyway, that'll be a fun time. That's going to be the normal time, open to everybody, streaming on Facebook, streaming on YouTube. And that'll be in 2 weeks. So just a couple things to look forward to that I'm looking forward to. Hopefully you are as well. And let's jump into this today. So I want to preface my thoughts before I jump into right-hand path, left-hand path, and kind of summarize stuff. I want to begin with the self, So I want you to think for a minute, what comes to mind when you think about your self, just as a concept, the concept of the self. What is the self? Who are you? What are you? How do you work? All that kind of stuff. All involved with the self. But I want you to think about what is your basic understanding or concept of the self, because when we begin with the self, it's easier, I think, to understand the difference between what I'm calling the left-hand path and the right-hand path. Now, I am using these terms the way that I understand them and the way that I've been able to integrate them in the best way that works for me. These are terms that are much, much older. Talked about this in the first video, talked about it in some of the others that I've talked about when I've talked about the left-hand path. It comes from Sanskrit writing. It's a very ancient concept. This idea that the left is sinister. In fact, the word sinister comes from, I think it's Latin. I don't think it's Greek. I think it's Latin. The word sinister means left or left hand. And of course, we use the term right to say that you're right, you're correct, you're accurate, you're right. But that comes from these ideas of right hand and left hand. The reason we use right to describe correct, or as a synonym for correct, is because of these ancient concepts of the right-hand path, left-hand path. And like any ancient concept, these things are going to evolve. They take on a life of their own, and they're going to change and morph from culture to culture, generation to generation. So I don't feel obliged in a very left-hand path way. I don't feel obliged to be beholden to any of the ideas or concepts that have developed around the left-hand path, because there are certainly things about the left-hand path as it's talked about in spiritual ways in our society that I don't want to incorporate into my personal life. So if you haven't watched any of the other stuff on right-hand path, left-hand path, no worries. This video will be self-contained. Let's see. Marie says the reading she gave me is phenomenal. Also, this would be great to have you both together. Yeah, I'm really, really looking forward to that. Excited about that. All right. So in order to understand what I'm trying to say about the right-hand path, left-hand path, it all begins and ends with the self. And for me, everything begins and ends with self. And I'll explain that in a moment. But left-hand path is a way of future casting a self. That's why we call it a path. So we all do future casting, future pacing, call it whatever you want, whether it is thinking about what you have to do this week, whether it's, I can think about the fact that I'm thinking about the weather. It's going to be super, super cold where I live. I've been getting several alerts on my phone about extreme cold conditions, very life-threatening on Monday and Tuesday. So I might be future casting. That's going to suck. I'm thinking about my future self having the experience of being cold. So we're always all sort of doing this. Another way of future casting is to think about goals, changes that we want to make. Where do we want to be in 6 months? Where do we want to be in 5 years? If we're health conscious at all, thinking about our health, or just thinking about our looks. So if we want to look good and feel good in our bodies, or we're just want to add years to our lives, see what I'm doing when I'm talking about adding years to my life, all of that is future casting. So from that perspective, then these are paths. The question becomes, where are we going? And are we going someplace with intentionality, with deep intention and purpose, or are we just sort of letting things happen? Both the right-hand path and left-hand path are called paths, which is simply an analogy. It's a metaphor. It's a map. It's not the territory. There isn't really in existence a right-hand path and a left-hand path. It's just a question of the intentionality of where we want to be regarding our own personal sense of meaning, spirituality. It does get into spirituality for me, and part of the purpose of doing all this is because of how it relates to spirituality. And I don't know how many of us are really intentional about our spirituality in terms of forecasting or future casting or future pacing where it is that we want to be. So therefore, it's affecting the decisions that we're making today. So I've been pretty open that I had a very, very, very serious health challenge in the end of August, early part of September. Really got my attention. And so I've been on this health journey absolutely changing things about myself, things about my lifestyle, and having to be very intentional about getting sleep, having to be very intentional about exercise, having to be very intentional about my weight and about my diet, and specifically about what kind of exercise I'm doing and how much exercise, all of these various things, because I'm on a journey. I'm future casting a healthier self. So that future casting helps me to make decisions today, and it helps me to take the actions necessary, have the attitudes necessary, have the motivation necessary in order to get to where I want to be, so that I'm being very intentional. So from that perspective, at least in that area of my life, I'm living from the inside out. This is a really good illustration of the left-hand path and the right-hand path. This is a left-hand path approach because I have goals that I've created in my mind. I have an image of myself. I have a plan. I have a strategy. I have a purpose. All of that's originating within me. So every morning when I get up and I eat, prepare my lunches. If I'm going to work, I'm preparing healthy lunches. I definitely have an idea of what I want my macros to be, what I want my micros to be. So it's very intentional. When I go into exercise, I'm very intentional about the type of exercise that I'm going to get. And intentional down to, if I'm going to do cardio today, am I going to do zone 2 cardio? Am I going to do high intensity cardio to go more after that VO2 max? All that stuff. So you can see there's a lot that goes into that. So I'm on a journey towards health. I'm not there yet. I'm not where I want to be. I'm not where I'm going to be. But I'm very intentional. I'm very intentional about my sleep and making sure that I get enough sleep. So intentional about diet, exercise, sleep, all of that stuff, because I have a goal and a desire inside myself to live longer, to be healthier, to come off medication, etc., and so on. So that's a left-handed path approach. A right-handed path approach to diet and exercise is where I was at before. That was, I'm not going to put any planning or preparation into anything. I'm just going to take it as it comes. And so therefore, I'm going to be somewhat controlled, but definitely completely impacted by the world around me. So here's what I mean. I'm going to get up. I'm not going to think about my lunch. I'm not going to think about my macros, things like protein, carbohydrates, fat. I'm not going to think about my micros, like what kind of vitamins am I getting? One of the things that showed up in my blood work was a lot of vitamin deficiency. Shocker, because I didn't eat a lot of vegetables. Didn't always remember to take multivitamins, things like that. Also, they're finding out that my body has difficulty absorbing certain nutrients. So I'm working on that. So this other approach, this other self that I was living in prior to August, what do I feel like eating today? I might ask people if I'm at work. I might ask people in the office, what are we having today? Oh, I don't know. Let's go together and get sushi, or let's have Mexican food today, or let's get a cheeseburger, or let's get KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken. I'm aging myself there. Or, some kind of fast food, or let's go to the cafeteria. Okay, what's the cafeteria have today? Let's say I choose to go to the cafeteria. What does the cafeteria have today? They got spaghetti and meatballs. Okay, well, I guess I'm eating spaghetti and meatballs. There was no intention. It was completely dictated to. Will I not get any kind of exercise? The total amount of exercise that I was getting my previous self was how much walking I could do. Walking's going to be dictated, at least where I live, to some degree by the weather. If it's rainy or snowy outside, if it's super windy, I'm not going to go walking. If it's a nice day, I'm going to go walking. So I think you get the point. That really kind of illustrates the difference between a left-hand path and a right-hand path, although a right-hand path is more intentional. I'll explain that in a minute. But I want to talk about this idea for a minute, that the self, I want to come back to this, that the self is the end all be all for me. The self is everything for me. Now, that may send shockwaves through the internet. If you've been watching me any time at all, probably not. If this is the first time you're hearing me, notice I didn't say selfishness or self-centeredness, although we're all self-centered, and I'll explain that in a minute. Self-centered is a good goal, actually, to have in the way I'm looking at and thinking about the self. But my point is that to make it very simple and silly, wherever you go, there you are. That the only thing that exists as far as you are concerned, the only thing that exists as far as I am concerned, are things in my world, things in your world, things in my sphere of influence in terms of my experience, knowledge, understanding, interaction, and engagement with anything forms up the sum total of my reality. I'll give you a basic example of this. I'm going to bet that none of you watching this, with a few exceptions, know any of my coworkers. I'm going to bet that unless you are somehow connected to me through my work at the university, that none of you know all of my coworkers. I have knowledge of those people. Those people exist for me. They are, in this sense, then, they are very real. How do I know that they're real? Because I talk to them, because I engage with them, because I have experience with them. But you have no idea, except that I say that I have coworkers. You have no idea that these people exist. You don't know them at all. So in your world, in your experience, they do not exist. They have no existence whatsoever. Same thing for you. People that you relate to, people that you know, people that you have experience with. And I've never had any interaction with them whatsoever. I don't even know their name. I don't know what they look like. I don't know what their personality's like. I don't know what their sense of humor is like. So for me, that person does not exist. You see what I'm saying? Definitely they have an independent existence of their own. But as far as I'm concerned, it makes no difference whatsoever in my life, no difference whatsoever whether those people exist or don't exist, whether those people are kind and loving or whether they're assholes. It makes no difference to me whatsoever. If you have someone in your life that's an asshole to you, that is certainly making a difference in terms of your life, in terms of your experience. It's part of your world. The self that I was before I landed in the hospital, other than the fact that maybe you watch me or some of you are my friends, and I'm sure all of you care about me on some level, but certainly that didn't have any impact whatsoever in your daily life. I watched one of those short videos or something that someone sent me, and they were talking about how even when we die, even those closest to us, there's going to be, and I want to be sensitive how I say this, especially if you're grieving or going through something or you've lost someone very, very close to you. But even the people that are closest to us, their life is going to go on. And the illustration that this person was using in this short video is, they'll go to the funeral, they'll be around friends, they'll cry, they'll share memories, they'll think about the person that they've lost. And then when the funeral's over, even those closest to us, I know because I did this, some of you maybe didn't, but even when I had someone very, very close to me die, it's like, okay, let's go get dinner. What's for dinner tonight? What are we going to eat today? What am I going to wear tomorrow? Like all those basic choices. This was in this video. And it really put things into kind of a perspective for me that our sense of self-importance to other people is probably more than likely overestimated. Our sense of importance to people is probably likely overestimated, but our sense of importance to ourselves is everything. Because again, everywhere we go, there we are. So that's what I mean when I say the self is the end all be all. It's the totality of who you are. Now let's step back from that a minute. Let's think about then how do we think about the self, which is what makes us uniquely human. That is the divine spark, if you will. That is what separates us from the rest of the species on this planet, except for maybe those that live in the ocean, like the dolphins and the whales and that kind of stuff. They probably, I think they're saying, have this same level of self-reflection, but every analogy breaks down. But you get what I'm saying here, the ability to self-reflect, the ability for the self to think about the self. And we do this. So the simple phrase that you might hear people throw around or use in on YouTube or in the spiritual circles is, I am, hey, Sarah. Sarah says, hey, great to see you. It's been a while. Again, sometimes when I look at comments, it takes me out of my flow of where I'm going or takes me on my train of thought, which is really a challenge when you don't have notes that you use. Okay, so this ability to think about the self, for the self to reflect on the self. You hear people in spiritual circles talk about, I need to get my ego out of the way. And by their ego, what are they talking about? Maybe they're talking about their sense of being separate from everything. But here's the point. If the ego in any aspect is a sense of self, for me, the ego is the sense of self in its entirety. But for a lot of people, you can't say, I'm going to get my ego out of the way, because there's an I that's removing the ego. And so it's just a different ego. It's what we call in the clinical mental health field, ego states. When I say I'm going to work on myself, well, who's the I and who's the self? Or you need to learn to love yourself. You need to learn to accept yourself. Who is the I that's loving, and who is the self that's being loved? And who is the I that's doing the accepting, and who is the self that's being accepted? You see what I'm saying? That is the divine spark. That is what separates us, that we become self-reflective. We see this in the Garden of Eden story, because we are told very plainly in there in the Garden of Eden myth with Adam and Eve that they were both naked and felt no shame. And then once they ate at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, their eyes were opened and they knew that they were naked. They came into a self-consciousness, the ability to see themselves and reflect upon and evaluate in terms of value judgments the self that they saw reflected in their own mind. So there was an elevation, and God says they have become like one of us now, knowing good and evil. That's why I talk about that specifically being the divine spark. And that's what sets us apart, this ability to think about the self, this ability to future cast a self and make total changes in the way that I am behaving is unique as an animal, as a human being, is unique to, say, a dog or a cat or a wolf or a bird or a snake. Like, it doesn't really have, snake can't say, well, I don't think I'm going to slither today. I ate that mouse and it gave me a tummy ache. And I think that tummy ache came from eating that mouse. I'm not going to eat mice anymore. And so it gives us a unique ability to adapt to the world that we're in and to adapt to our surroundings. But at the end of the day, this is super important. And I'm going to come back to something I said about my coworkers. You don't know that they even exist, except that, I have coworkers. But if I were to say their names and not tell you their relationship to me, it would mean nothing to you because they're not part of yourself. They're not part of your world. They're not part of your universe. So the only thing that matters to us, the only thing that makes any difference at all is that which comes into our circle of self or our circle of influence. Another way to illustrate this, since I'm talking about circles, an ancient way of illustrating this is really interesting. Hadn't necessarily planned on going here, but this is interesting. The self is represented as a circle in a lot of philosophies, especially ancient stuff. The self is represented as a circle with a dot in the center. So I want you to get that picture in your mind. A circle with a dot in the center, and that is the self. And there is nothing that exists for you outside that circle, not in any meaningful way. Sure, I know that Mars exists, but unless I'm really into astrology or astronomy, Mars makes no difference to me. In other words, if I'm into astronomy, I might be checking it out in a telescope or know where it is in regard to the sky. I may be able to look up and identify it. But beyond that, it has no relevance to me in my life. Most people in our society, I would dare to say, a lot of people either have a very, 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 did I say very? A very surface understanding of astrology and what it is, which is why I'd recommend you turn in 2 weeks to watch my interview with Lisa. You'll learn a lot. Most people think it has to do with the constellations, when in reality, it's not an either or, it's an and both, but it has much more to do with the planets than we probably realize. So then maybe Mars has more effect if you're into that stuff. But otherwise, I know Mars, my point is, I know Mars exists, but I'm not going to Mars anytime soon. Mars could probably completely blow up, and as long as it didn't affect the Earth atmosphere or its rotation around the sun, or then who cares, right? It doesn't exist. This is really important to remember when we're talking about things like theist, atheist, anti-theist, whether or not you're a scientific materialist, whether you believe in pantheism or panentheism or some form of idealism. I know I'm throwing out big philosophical terms. My point is, there are some people that just automatically dismiss anything extraordinary, dare I say supernatural. I'm trying to move away from using that term because that shakes things up for people. But there's anyone who speaks about ghosts, anyone who speaks about ESP, anyone who speaks about spirit beings that are disincarnate, that they can interact with, Anybody that talks about any kind of a supernatural phenomenon, like I'm talking about, there is a level of skepticism in our culture and our society that thinks in a very arrogant sort of way, oh, bless their heart, they believe in that stuff. Or in a more aggressive way, oh, well, that's just superstition, right? For other people that are more spiritual, or maybe that have had more experiences than that, there's a lot of people that tap into psychic abilities. They're just born with them. They know that they have them. They can be very problematic for people. And so for them, that world is very real. That world definitely exists. You see what I'm saying? So when we look at the world from the perspective of the only thing we know about in our world is what lands in that circle, we're in the center. Our consciousness is in the center of that circle. But the only thing that exists in our world is what has overlapped or moved into our circle. Then we believe that's what exists because we have experience with it. Or if we hear the testimony of someone else, there are other influencing factors that have come into the circle of self that cause us to either be open to that person's testimony and say, yeah, this person has no reason to lie. I don't know everything. I'm sure this probably happened to this person. Wow. The world is much weirder and bigger and stranger than I realized. There's much more out there than I know about. Or just outright dismiss it. That's superstition. That's I talked to somebody recently that they were telling me that they've done this sort of paranormal track or path of following all these investigators, local investigators. I've been to all the local haunted places and various different most haunted places in Colorado, etc., trying to experience something, and everything that they've seen, they've never experienced anything, and everything that they've seen can be explained in some other way. So they're probably going to be more inclined to dismiss the extraordinary or the supernatural. Why? Because of that circle of self. So just in the same way that my coworkers don't exist, but I know they exist because I've had experience with them, it's easy for people to say ghosts don't exist who have never had any experience with them, or God doesn't exist who have never had any real experience with God, right? Now, there are those of us that have had what we thought were experiences with God, and maybe that changed our mind, et cetera, and so on. But you see what I'm saying? It's important that we keep this in mind. Therefore, it is impossible, absolutely impossible, in my way of thinking, to get past any kind of self-serving bias or confirmation bias. People talk about confirmation bias all the time. We have a confirmation bias. It's impossible to not have a confirmation bias because you are a finite being. What is a confirmation bias, Aaron? It's it's what I'm talking about. If you are a scientific materialist and an atheist, then anyone who tells you they had a vision of Jesus appeared to them in their bedroom and spoke to them and healed them of a disease, and they could see him with their open eyes, right? More than likely, if they're a devout atheist, their self-serving bias or their confirmation bias is going to be, there's another explanation for this, and they're going to start looking for another explanation for this. They're doing that from the place of their confirmation bias. By the same token, I definitely have a confirmation bias about the spirit world, about source, creator, God. God is a problematic word for me, but I definitely have confirmation biases with that. And it's based on my experience, that which has come into my circle. Now, the point in the circle, for those of you that may be tuning in late, I'm talking about the self, talking about an ancient representation of the self, being a circle with a point in the center of it. The center point is my individual consciousness, that which makes me alive, that which makes me aware. Everything else exists within that circle. The only thing about the self that does not change on some level is that dot in the middle. That is eternal. That is perpetual. That is everlasting. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Well, just incidentally, this interesting point. So you'll find these in cave drawings and things like this. Then there is a cross drawn. If you draw a straight line from the top of the circle through the point to the bottom, you have a straight vertical line. And then you can draw through the center a straight horizontal line. And what do you end up with? You end up with a cross. This is the basis for all mandalas. It's also the basis for almost all Christian art. Is another topic for another day. But when you understand some of these philosophies and how a lot of these artists who created Christian art were thinking and how they were using the point and the circle and understanding sacred geometry, phrases like squaring the circle, and they would work this into their artistic patterns, then what you begin to discover is that Christ, the Jesus figure, or sometimes Mary, but usually holding Jesus, or even the Sacred Heart art, is a representation of the self. But that's for another talk. So the right-hand path, left-hand path has to do with the self. Now, I have been pretty firm, maybe too much so. One of the things Lisa helped me discover, Lisa Brown, that's going to be on my show in 2 weeks, talking about astrology. One of the things that she helped me understand is that I forget which house it is, but it governs like our public presentation, the way people know us in public, governs our communication style, stuff like that. There's a lot of Scorpio energy there. So I have a tendency to have my stinger out too much. And that was really helpful information because I can definitely see that. I can relate to that, trying to master that energy a little bit. So one of the things that will bring my stinger out, though, is when people say there is no self. And this is usually happens only in spiritual circles, New Age circles, or things that have imported to some degree some philosophies from the East. And I've had several people say to me, there is no self, there's only the illusion of self. And they will give this example that, sometimes referring to themselves, before I was married, I was not, and now I'm a husband, but there was a time before I was married when I wasn't a husband. I'm a father, but there was a time when I wasn't a father. I'm a grandfather, but there's a time that I wasn't a grandfather. I remember someone asked me, you were a pastor, are you a pastor now? So if someone were to say, who are you? And you say, I'm a pastor, but you can see that you're not a pastor now. So, and then they conclude, therefore there is no self. That's not very deep thinking in my worldview. That's not very high on Bloom's taxonomy, if you know what I'm talking about. Because the center point never changes. I had the self-reflective experience of not being a dad, of being a son, of being a athlete in high school. I had the sense of self of, as an athlete, of competing. I definitely had the sense of self as being a pastor, definitely know myself before I was a pastor and after I was a pastor. But there's a center there that knows these things, and that is stable and that never changes. So in the ancient art, the dot is in the center. Now, what in the world, Aaron, does all this stuff have to do with right-hand path, left-hand path? It's very simple. All of us, because we have this self, because we have this divine spark, this ability to self-reflect, then we have to go out and relate to the world around us. Whatever comes into our circle of self, whatever comes into our conscious awareness, whatever we have experience with, whatever we, Shannon says no dot in the circle. Yeah, exactly. So how does this play? That is a right-hand path way of thinking about things. Nothing wrong with it. It's a map. It's not the territory. My personal belief is that it is a map that does not accurately reflect the territory. At least it does not accurately reflect the territory in a way that is preferential or serving to me. And I am comfortable having a confirmation bias and a self-serving bias because, as I said earlier, you can't get around them. And I'm not content to go searching outside of my own culture, if you will, to try to find and import ideas and spiritual practices that are completely alien and completely foreign to my own culture. Some of that has to do with the fact that I actually believe that I do believe in reincarnation. I do believe we had some sense of choice about how we would incarnate, and I incarnated in the West. Maybe at other times I was incarnated in the East. Maybe I'll incarnate some other form, but I don't so despise who I am and despise my own culture. This is me talking. I'm not passing judgment on anybody else. I'm not saying if you're into some kind of Eastern spirituality that you despise your culture. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that for me, that's what that would have to imply, that I cannot find something that is satisfying spiritually within the context of my own culture, even though I have serious issues with Abrahamic religions, which are the predominant philosophies, spiritual paths, etc., within the Western culture. All right, I think my Scorpio's coming out. Reel that back in. All right. So as we're interacting with the world, there are things that will cause us to adapt our circle or what is within the circle. So when I was talking earlier, pastor is in my circle. It was a role that I played. It was never who I was. My belief system, as it was 10 years ago, about God, about myself, about the nature of the universe, the nature of reality, that's inside my circle. But those were belief systems. Those were philosophies. They weren't me. They were aspects of me, but they weren't the point in the center. Make sense? Now I have a totally different way of thinking about things. I used to identify as very conservative on the political spectrum. Now I'm probably left of center on the political spectrum. Neither one of those, I might have said I am a Republican, I am a conservative. I never have been a Democrat, never have considered myself a liberal, but I'm certainly not what I was before. But regardless, those are ideas, and all of those are influenced by whatever came into my circle. So my point is that there is this interpenetrating relationship. You might call it communion, an interpenetrating relationship. It's penetrating me and I'm penetrating it, between this thing that I have that I call self and my ability to think about the self and the world around me. And this requires a ton of adaptation. This requires a ton of adaptation. So one of the things about being uniquely human is we understand that nature, at times at least, is not our friend. Natural disasters. I talked about, this week they're forecasting very cold wind chill factors, like we're talking 30 below wind chill factors, and not really getting much above that for, a 24-hour to 48-hour period. And they say that's very threatening to life. So that forces me to adapt my plans. So my plans for a weekend would be totally different when it's 30 below outside than it would be on a nice spring day when it's 70 degrees outside. So the self has to adapt to the world, right? Now, there are ways to compensate for this and overcome this. I can still take my walk in 30 below weather if I want to wrap up in several layers, make sure there's no skin exposed so I'm not risking frostbite. And I'm doing all this stuff. I'm adapting the self to the weather. The weather's not going to adapt to me. Now, take this on a societal level. On a societal level, then, community, friendship, a sense of belonging, the need for acceptance, the need for affirmation, the need for esteem, to be esteemed, among people. Generally, when we talk about love, love is one of those things. What is love? It can mean different things to different people. The guy that wrote the 5 love languages talks about how, people experience and attach love meaning to various different things that people do. My love language is time spent, or my love language is whatever. But at the end of the day, it has to do with how highly I'm esteemed by someone else. How much value does a person attach to my being and my existence in their world and their life? If they attach a lot of significance to that, then I'm going to say that person loves me. If they don't, if they attach the wrong kind of significance, if they devalue me, I don't get honor, I experience shame. These are all social emotional needs, and they're real, very, very real needs. So even from an evolutionary perspective, the need to belong to a tribe, the need to belong to a group of people, the fact that I live in America, and so therefore, more than likely, there's not going to be an invasion of some foreign country. So I'm not going to be living in a war-torn area like we see in various parts of the world today. So it benefits me to be an American, to live in America. So you can see that we needed tribes, we needed groups, we needed people for protection, for safety, for survival. So it gets down to that really basic need of survival. But we have these social emotional needs. We have the need to be esteemed. We have the need to be accepted. These are needs. Those of us, especially those of us that do embrace left-hand path, we like to think that we are above that or we are beyond that. We want to be too spiritual for that. I know I definitely went through that as a Christian. That's a right-hand path. So it's not just left-hand path people, but can't tell you how many times I took comfort from the words of Jesus. Blessed are you when men hate you for, woe unto you when all men speak well of you. Jesus said, blessed are you when people hate you and they spit your name out with disgust. You're blessed. So, rather sometimes instead of addressing, wow, this is really hurtful, and trying to heal and repair the relationship or figure out the relationship in a different way, it was just really easy to sink into a form of spiritual bypassing that became a martyr or persecution complex. But anyway, I think you get my point, that the self is adapting, or we're making the world adapt to us. Perfect example with my health. Prior to my health crisis last fall, shit was just happening in regards to my health. Whatever they're serving in the cafeteria, that's what I'm going to eat this day. So the self is going to follow the influences of what's around me. Now I pack my lunch and I'm very intentional about what I eat. So therefore, what I'm eating is coming from within. If you understand what I mean, coming from the intention, coming from the purpose, coming from the future casting, that's determining whether or not I exercise. That's determining not just what I eat, but also when I eat. See, all those things. So I'm making the world adapt to me, if that makes sense. So if they're serving spaghetti and meatballs at the cafeteria, I don't have to eat the spaghetti and meatballs because I brought some salmon and salad with Greek yogurt dressing on it or something like that. I don't have to go see what's in the vending machine to have a snack. I've almost always got broccoli and cauliflower and carrots and stuff now that I can snack with. See, I'm forcing my will then onto the world. Whereas before, I was just letting the world happen, right? Based on my understanding of myself, based on where I want to be, the path that I'm on, the health journey that I'm on is very intentional. It's coming from the inside, and I'm imposing my will, my intention, my purpose onto my environment rather than allowing the environment to impose its health or unhealth onto me. And they both lead to two very different places that I've lived and shared with you in real time. Prior to that is just whatever the world, whatever health or unhealth the world had to give me, I'm good with that. and I'm going to let that influence and adapt myself. That landed me in the hospital almost dead. Now, I'm much more intentional, and that path is leading me to a place of remarkable recovery, health, longevity, longer years, feeling better, looking better, having more confidence, all of that stuff. Does that make sense to you? Now, right hand, so one's kind of resembles a right-hand path, the other resembles the left-hand path. The point is this: are we adapting the self? Let me back up and say it this way. The right-hand path of spirituality, so we're talking on a spectrum. The right-hand path of spirituality is a journey, an approach. I want to get somewhere with my spiritual life. It is an approach. I want to get somewhere with myself, as an approach to the self. That's what these are. And this is why, is there a middle path? Sure. But I think if we start thinking middle path immediately, we're not really necessarily grasping fully the concept as it relates to the self, which is why I'm doing this video today. This all has to do with the self. From the right-hand path perspective, myself, in some way, shape, or form, needs to change. And not for self-serving purposes. It needs to change because it is incompatible with something outside of itself. So in this case, God, source, universe, whatever the case may be. Because again, now we're talking about spiritual paths. So right-hand path is this self. When there are these contradictions, these discomforts, these invasions of this thing outside of me that I call God, or the religious community, or the universe, or suffering, the self always has to give. The self always has to give. The self has to be dissolved. The more that the self can conform, the more I can make my circle, whatever's inside my circle, conform to the will, the nature, the laws, the desire of an other, of something else. The more I give way to this sense, the more I give way, the more I absorb the other into myself, the more I take the other into my circle, then I'm changing and adapting. My circle's changing and adapting. It's conforming. From a spiritual perspective, this would be the right-hand path. So from a Christian perspective, I need to change the self to fit with whatever God says, this object outside of me called God, whatever God says that I am supposed to be. Obedience. So I need to be in the will of God. Not my will, but thy will be done. Heaven, as it's conceived of, the afterlife, is some space where only God's will is done. It's in the Lord's Prayer, for crying out loud. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy will be done. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's a right-handed path prayer. I'm going to conform myself. Another example of the right-handed path. Now remember, this is a path, so I'm future casting. So I want to be discipled as a Christian. I want to grow spiritually. I want to study my Bible. Why am I studying my Bible? Well, to get to know God. Well, why am I getting to know God? Yeah, Renegade says, or whatever ACIM, A Course in Miracles says, same principle. I was actually, it's funny you bring up A Course in Miracles because I was thinking about that as I was talking. Because almost every system in the West of spirituality that is popularized has this right-hand path bend to it. There is no self, as far as I understand it, in A Course in Miracles, because there's only the self, there's only God. God is all that there is. Everything else is an illusion, which presupposes that there is something that is not God. I don't know how they get around that, because if it's God and illusion, then if there's God and illusion. Anyway, I don't want to get off on all that. I mean, it just ties me nuts. But yes, that's an example of right-hand path. Anything that talks about oneness in a merger sort of way. So I believe in oneness. I absolutely believe in oneness, and that there is an all that exists. But I think about it more in terms of the physical body would be analogous to that, or cells within the physical body would be analogous to that. Maybe this is a holdover from my Christian thinking and the body of Christ. And each part having its own part to play, but the body is still one. I'm okay. I'm cool with oneness in that way. But when it's oneness that is merging, in other words, my stomach cells have to learn how to now become immune system cells. They need to act like white blood cells instead of digestive cells. The acid in my stomach needs to turn into something that's fighting invaders in the body rather than breaking down food. You see what I'm saying? And so a lot of this teaching on oneness, oh, we're all one of the things that drives me nuts, personal pet peeve of mine, and I'm just going to have to learn to live with this like I'm learning to live with snow. I mean, getting worked up about this and trying to address this is like trying to make it stop snowing. In spiritual circles, this concept that we're all one. So whatever I do to you, I do to myself. I don't know what kind of version of self you have. If you think that makes no sense to me whatsoever. But where it bugs me is that if I have unity consciousness, then I'm more spiritually advanced. I'm enlightened. In fact, for a lot of people, enlightenment is coming to the realization of what they call unity consciousness. And so this idea of do no harm to other people, or do unto others as you would have them do unto as you would do unto yourself, is when I do something to you, I'm doing it to myself. So therefore, I'm not going to do it. Even though most of these systems say there is no self. I mean, it's all so confusing. It's all so confusing. But you get what I'm saying. This idea that the only reason that I'm treating someone well is because if I do it to them, I'm doing it to me, is the same exact thing to me as I'm only performing this action and restraining myself because I don't want to go to hell. I know there was lots of people, not lots of people. I had lots of people come at me with, well, if there's no hell, then I might as well just go out and live like a heathen, which tells me they're restraining their inner heathen, number one. They've judged their inner heathen as bad. And number two, the only reason you're not giving full expression to your instincts is because you don't want to go to hell. So from that perspective, then an atheist who has morals and ethics and treats other people well is more evolved in their personal integrity than a Christian who just does it because they don't want to go to hell. See what I'm saying? So if I say, well, I'm only because we're all one and whatever I do to you, I'm doing to myself, that's not impressive. That's actually the epitome of selfishness. I'm a much better proponent of maybe what Martin Buber referred to as the I and the thou, that you are a self-contained self. You have a circle. You have a dot in the middle of your circle. I have a circle, which is the self. And I have a dot in the middle of my circle. And our circles are going to overlap and interact. And I want to make sure when they overlap and interact that you have a positive, enriching, and value-enriched added experience and not something that is horrible for you. Doesn't mean I always do it. Doesn't mean I don't always, any of that stuff. But you understand what I'm saying. I got off on craziness. So, but that's right-hand path. So if I'm trying to experience oneness with God in the sense that I'm trying to evaporate or get rid of the ego, that is a right-hand path of spirituality. Remember, we're using the term path because we're talking about a journey and we're talking about where you want to go with your, whatever you're doing spiritually. What's your objective or intention? Are you being intentional? So, whereas when I was illustrating my health experiences and saying I'm going to eat whatever's at the cafeteria, that's not intentional enough to be considered a right-hand path approach if I'm using it in an analogous way. So with the right-hand path, again, with Christianity, most of us can relate to, I want to become obedient. I want to become submissive to the will of God. Not my will, but thy will be done. And then whatever the community says, whatever the authority says, I'm going to submit to the authorities that are there. I'm going to conform. I'm going to conform in belief. I'm going to sign a belief statement. I'm going to go to catechism. I'm going to join the church. We don't believe like that here. We don't practice that here. Okay, I want to be part of the group. I want to believe that. I want to practice that. But in order to have fellowship with this group or communion with this group over here, I'm going to surrender that. I'm going to give that up. I'm going to push that outside of my circle of self. I'm going to push that outside of my experience. All this stuff that Paul gets into about mortification of the flesh, walking after the Spirit and not after the flesh, the works of the flesh in contrast with the fruit of the Spirit. That's all right-hand path stuff, because at the end of the day, it's the self adapting to the other, in this case, God, the Bible, the community that is outside of myself. Another spiritual path, A Course in Miracles, since Renee brought it up. Yeah. I've got to lose my illusions. And when I lose my illusions and I forgive, then that's the way to end my suffering. That's the way to be fulfilled. That's what I need to learn in this life. Again, nothing wrong with it. A lot of people have been enriched. Their lives have been changed. I think it's a lot better than other Jesus-centered belief systems, for sure. And it's a right-hand path. Now, the left-hand path with the self takes a different approach. The left-hand path with the self is much more intentional about the self and wants to work on the self and work on the world from the position of inside out rather than outside in, from the place of intentionality, from the place of, again, embracing all of the aspects of the self. So I have a shadow self. You have a shadow self. One of the things that I talked about in this series of videos that I'm doing is that the concept of shadow work has been evolved from its origins with Carl Jung in depth psychology in the last century. It has evolved into the, I'm going to use this term very loosely. Don't get triggered by this. I'm just using this term loosely. It has become the intellectual property. I'm using that term property in the sense that they are the ones that are talking about it. It's no longer the intellectual property. That language, that concept of shadow work no longer really exists much within therapeutic circles or psychology. I know people that have doctorates in psychology that never learned a thing other than a survey of history about Carl Jung and his work. And they have a PhD. it's become the property. So when we talk about shadow work, the shadow self, from the holistic spiritual perspective, they took that and they're the ones talking about it. They're the ones sharing about it. But the way that term's evolved, the way it's used, has nothing to do with the way the early depth psychologists understood it. Because anything that you have any conscious awareness of, by definition, I remember Carl Jung's the one that gave us the term, it is not shadow, because it's in the light. It's in the light of consciousness. For them, the shadow is the aspects of the self that I don't know exist. So if it's trauma, unless it's deeply repressed trauma that I've forgotten about, if I know about the trauma, it's in the light. It's no longer part of the shadow. Now, I still need to work on that. I still might be hiding that from the world. There may be desires and wants and urges that I have, proclivities, fetishes, whatever, kinks, whatever, that you have or that I have or whatever, that I might not show to the world, but I know that they're there. I'm conscious, I'm aware of them. Therefore, it's not shadow. Shadow is that which exists in shadow. And so this is why really the only two ways, and this is probably oversimplified, I'm certainly not a Jungian analyst, but the only two ways, as far as I'm aware, of doing shadow work from the early depth psychology perspective is dream work, because your shadow will show up in your dreams, and your projections, your emotional charges and projections on other people, owning those projections and taking them back. What I see in other people that I think doesn't exist in me, but really is all about me, that's a projection. And then, of course, dream work. But so there's these shadow aspects in terms, when I use that term, I mean from the spiritual perspective, things like trauma, instinct, urges, all that kind of stuff, things that I'm ashamed of, it all gets dumped over here. And from a right-hand path perspective, I want to wash those away in the blood of Jesus. I want those transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. I want Christ to live in me so I don't give expression to those things. And I'm very intentional about that approach. Left-hand path says all aspects of myself are good. All aspects, and so I want to work with all of these aspects of myself. I'm not going to demand that any of them be done away with, crucified, mortified, absorbed into something else, subsumed by something else, assimilated by something else. I'm going to find all of those aspects, and I'm going to impose my will into my life. And my sense of the divine is not outside of me. My sense of the divine is within me. Now, someone will say, I can hear you thinking, or I'm just remembering comments that other people have made. But Aaron, I believe in both. I believe in a God who's immanent, who dwells within us, and I believe a God who is transcendent, who also exists beyond us. Okay, but it's at that line where the indwelling divine self and where the immanent divinity inside of us and the transcendent divinity outside of us, where they intersect, how do you manage that relationship determines whether or not you're taking a right-hand approach or a left-hand approach. A right-hand approach would say, well, of course, God is bigger than me. God is wiser than me. God is more powerful than me. And yes, I am divine, but there's also a divinity, an aspect of divinity that's bigger and greater than me. And so when it comes to crossroads, where we're in sync, we're in sync. Where we're not in sync, or maybe it's impossible to not be in sync. I don't know. It's however you approach that. From the left-hand path, it's saying, I'm going to concretize. I'm going to individuate. In other words, if what's important to me is important enough to me to find a way to express that, find a way to actualize that. Find a way to raise that. So instead of raising my vibration in order to merge with something else, I am raising my vibration in order to relate well with something else. That's the primary difference. So am I relating well with, if I believe in it, the transcendence of Source or God or other entities that are out there that are spiritual in nature or non-physical, or however we want to understand that? I don't want to get hung up on the semantics. Am I relating well with those, or am I seeking to merge with those? So my point in all of this is that left-hand path has a spirituality, or it's not a path. And the reason it's a path is because you're going somewhere. So right-hand path, I'm intentionally being absorbed into something else and losing the self. Left-hand path, I'm intentionally trying to differentiate this self, individuate this self, actualize this self, meaning bring it out into the world. So I'm raising my vibration, which, by the way, that's just a metaphor. I'm raising my vibration to go to a higher level, to join this social mind complex or the divine or God or nature or whatever the case may be, the nothing, the void, heaven, nirvana, whatever. Or I'm raising my vibration in order to have the ability to impose my desires, my will, my various aspects of myself. Impose might be a bad word, but not necessarily, because this is where the conflict and the warfare comes in. This is where Lilith comes in as an archetype for the left-hand, spiritual archetype for the left-hand path. I am, she used the name of God. I want to be on top. I want equality. If you don't like that, I'm out of here. Right? Lucifer, I will, the 5 I wills of Lucifer. I will. I don't care what the order is here. I'm not going to stay in my place. I'm not going to remember who I am. I will ascend above the stars of God. I will violate the order on purpose, with intention. Screw that. See, so Lucifer, I will set myself on the farther sides of the north. I will be like the Most High. So from a Luciferian perspective, and I'm saying Luciferian, I'm not talking about the philosophy or the religion. I'm talking about from the archetype of Lucifer. From a Luciferian perspective, I will be like something. I will be like the Most High. Perfectly fine, is totally different than, say, the Pauline approach, or at least the approach that we have in Colossians, 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says, you know, everything will be put under his feet. I'm thinking 1 Corinthians 15, and God will be all in all. Or the Course in Miracles, God is all there is, and any sense of separation is a sense of self is a sense of separation. It's an ego. It's something that I have to get rid of. When I say I will be like the Most High, it's different than I will merge with the Most High. I will experience oneness with the Most High. I will lose my sense of self. Maybe this is the best way to say it. Right-hand path is I want to dissolve the sense of separation between myself and the all. Left-hand path is I want to really, really, really strengthen the separation between myself and the all, so that we can have an I and thou relationship. So I can have a relationship with it. So right-hand path is into it, in Christ, in God. The Father is in me, versus relationship with. And the reason this is a spiritual path is because it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to undo, to find what is your unique point. To bring this full circle, pun intended that time, when I talked about the ancient picture of the self, the ancient understanding of the self, is the circle with the point in the middle. And the point is the essence of consciousness and awareness. It is the center point of your awareness and your existence. And then everything else within the circle represents the self. It is very challenging to discover what does that center point want? Who am I? Why am I here? What am I? Where am I going? How shall I then live? Right? Shadow work is hard from both camps. Shadow work, which, because I'm a clinical therapist, I'm not harping on people that use this term. Because I'm a clinical therapist, most of what we call shadow work for me is trauma work. Whether it's that, or whether it's stuff I don't know about myself, but it's there, and I need to go deep diving to discover what's there through dream interpretation or other forms of depth psychology, shadow work. It's work. Resisting and going against the current is work. But here's the good news. If you are one of these people that believes in source, that believes in spiritual assistance or help, whether that comes from spirit guides, whether that comes from your ancestors, whether that just comes from spirit or comes from angels or comes from telepathically some alien race like the Arcturians or the Palladians. That there is those, you can be inclusive. In other words, you can still be theistic and on a left-hand path and practice spirituality. You can include spiritual practices. You can include spiritual input in regards to angels, guides, whatever that you might believe in. Anything that's coming into your circle of awareness is something that you're learning how to relate to, and relationship does require some adaptation. So this isn't a totally bifurcated, dualistic frame between right hand and left hand. It's simply, what is the intention? Is the intention to really live from the inside out? And so for me, I shifted about 8 or 9 years ago. I'm going to be authentic. I'm going to delve into this discovery of self. I'm going to take on what the ancient alchemists called the great work, what's represented in the magician card in the tarot, where he's got his workbench with the various other suits represented on the workbench. The great work. I'm going to work on self for the purpose of abundance, satisfaction, self-expression, self-love, self-actualization. And that, for me, is a spiritual path. So now I'm going to evaluate all things in relationship to that dot in the center, and maybe growing that dot, if that makes any kind of sense. It's hard. Sometimes it's hard to find the right words to communicate these things. So I'm going to relate well. I'm going to adapt where I need to adapt. But where I don't need to adapt, I'm not going to assume that I'm wrong. I'm not going to conform to the group just for the sake of conformity. Now, the flip side of this is also true. I don't want to be in the position where I'm oppositional or defiant, and that's my default. And I'm unconsciously, this is where we get into real shadow work. Not real shadow work. Sorry. I'm sorry for saying that. This is where we get into shadow work from the depth psychology perspective. That's what I mean. I'm really sorry I said that, because I mean, from the depth psychology perspective, I just want to be really clear on what I intend to communicate. From the depth psychology perspective, some people have an oppositional trait that they're completely unaware of. So they're going to be contrary to whatever the popular thing is at the time. So if the rest of the world or my environment is Christian, I grew up in a Christian home, I'm going to challenge Christianity. But if your home was Wicca, you'd be challenging Wicca. If your home was ACIM, you'd be challenging ACIM, because you don't realize your default is to just be oppositional. I'm going to challenge any system, the healthcare system. I'm going to challenge the religious system. I'm going to challenge the political system. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. The question is, are you doing it consciously and with intention, or are you doing it by subconscious default and you don't even realize it? Shannon says it's quite easy for me to be oppositional. Me too. I kind of have that bent in me, and that's why, confirmation bias, I prefer a left-hand path of spirituality. That, and also I just was miserable on the right hand. It just wasn't. It worked for me in the sense that life was working, but it didn't work for me in that I felt completely and totally like I was just going through the motions, completely and totally disconnected from what I was doing on that right-hand path. And so the left-hand path for me is very, very helpful, because it gives me a frame that, for me, removes me from the temptation, at least, to take on an inferiority complex in my own spiritual life and spiritual practices, because I'm not all about oneness and unity consciousness and there is no self and let's get rid of the ego and let's lose this sense of separation, or let's conform completely and totally to the image of Christ, or let's make the goal mystical oneness and union with God. Like, none of those things fit for me right now. That doesn't mean I won't go back to them, but for right now, it doesn't fit for me. But it allows me to take various different aspects of various different paths. There may be things, there isn't, but I haven't really studied it thoroughly. There may be things, as we were talking about A Course in Miracles, there may be things about A Course in Miracles that I would read and come across and say, I want to adapt that. I want to make that part of my life and part of my practice. And I would feel free to borrow from that. There may be things from, I don't even want to say the term, because I'm paranoid about satanic panic. But there may be things from Anton LaVey's work that I look at and say, that really makes sense to me. That's something that I can take and I can incorporate into this individuated path that I'm on. Definitely things from objective idealism of someone, say Bernardo Kastrup, and say, yeah, I like that. I'm going to incorporate that. Definitely some things about scientific materialism that I think are helpful. And there are areas specifically talking about health, knowing what to eat, knowing how to exercise, knowing what I need to do to cooperate with the healing process in my body. I'm not taking a full-blown intuitive approach. There is some intuition with it, but I also want to know what the science says. I want to know what the statistics say. I want to know what is going to move the needle. For me, it's not a zero-sum game. I want to know holistically, is there anything in acupuncture that can help? Is there anything with supplements that can help? I want to incorporate those things. Certainly, I'm taking a shit ton of supplements, but I'm also right now taking a shit ton of medicine. So I don't have any bias against. I mean, I hate that big pharma makes a shit ton of money off of exploiting people and their health. Where I do lean to the left is I think having a single payer health system where we have free healthcare in this country it's insane that we don't have that. I think that's absolutely insane that we don't have that. I think everybody should have. I think part of being right to life is that everybody has that. So it's not a zero-sum game for me. I'm thankful that Big Pharma literally, I'm here because of Big Pharma. There were medications that they gave me in the hospital that absolutely saved my life and brought me literally from death's door back to feeling better than I felt in years. So it's not a zero-sum game for me. What's the point that you're making, Aaron? The point that I'm making is that's left-hand path. Left-hand path is not oppositional. I want to be oppositional to society just because I can. I want to be oppositional to religion just because I want to be. And be oppositional to whatever the popular frame is, because that's my shadow. That's my real shadow. That's the thing that's subconscious that I don't even know that I'm doing it subconsciously. Right? Left-hand path says I can borrow from all of these things and adapt them to myself, because at the end of the day, that's the goal and the purpose, is for the best, most authentic, most satisfied, most abundant, highest version of myself, happiest version of myself that I can possibly be, while at the same time relating well with everything around me and making contributions to everything around me and living with ethics and morals and things like that. So in other words, I'm not going to, there is even sacrificing self. Look, I had to sacrifice the version of me that was sloppy with my health. I had to sacrifice the version of me that was a night owl and didn't like to get sleep for whatever reason. I had to sacrifice the version of me that just put whatever I wanted to in my mouth. I had to sacrifice the version of me that had to really, once you're in shape, exercising is not as bad. Except that you realize, okay, in order to get more benefit out of this, I got to shock my body again like I did in the beginning. But for me, I don't mind shocking my body once I'm in shape. But, getting past that phase, right? All right. Hopefully this made sense to you. Hopefully this is helpful. It seems like it is. Renegade says, as a spiritual guide, I have chosen Dr. Gabor Mate. I think I'm saying that right. I've heard his videos and looked at his work for sure. But, when you read something, you're never sure if you're pronouncing it right. Right, Renegade? Like, I don't know. To Renegade or Renegade? I'm not sure. But I love you. You're one of my really just, I feel like a soulmate type affinity with her, for sure. Anyway, I've chosen Dr. Gabor Mate. At the moment, he balances everything so wonderfully. Yeah, he's got some amazing work. Can't speak highly enough about his work. Let's see. Yeah, I think I read that one already. Boy, I love that Lucifer guy. Such a powerful archetype of resistance, rebellion that's healthy, that asserts the self. Perfect archetype for the left-hand path. Doesn't mean that we're Luciferian or that we worship Lucifer by any means. But I know some of my Christian friends and pastors out there that still watch this. I know you do. I hear about it. I know they think, oh my God, of course he's talking about this because he's really gone off the deep end into doctrines of demons. Anyway, I'm just rambling. I need to go. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to this, watching this, spending time, especially if you got to the end. Just a reminder, next Sunday at 2:00 Eastern time, Eastern Standard Time on the East Coast of the United States, 2 p.m. that time, we'll be doing a Zoom call to talk about these concepts. So please join us for that. That's only available to those in the New Day Global group. let's see what else. Oh yeah, and then in 2 weeks I'm gonna have Lisa Brown with me, and I'm gonna interview her. Really excited about that, and be talking about astrology. So anyway, bless you, namaste. You know what? I just like God bless you. I'm just gonna go back to saying that because I can. So God bless you. Have a great day, evening, night, morning, whatever time it is for you there, late night. And I'll be back with you again in the next video.